Hello, I'm Fawnde, aka Carson. It should be the other way around because my real name's Carson. Anyway, this is the second attempt at this recap because the first one was very stuffed. So we're restarting. Hello, this is going to be a recap for a couple sessions that we missed out on. Briefly, I talked about in the last video, which I would like to make a statement on again, is I like my drive to feel the need to make sure I get these done. Because in reality, we all know, aka probably me, because my net statement means no one's probably watching. I know, as we all do, that most likely no one's watching this series to this point or paying that much attention. It's very not professionally made. There's hard to watch moments, a lot of scuff, not very enjoyable to watch through and through, and it's also really long. To be at session, which I believe this is going to be 75, and waiting to watch the recap just to know what happened, in reality, it's not going to mean anyone. So I just realized whenever I make these, because it's been since maybe, it might have been 8 months, I think it's at least been 6 months since this stuff happened that I'm about to recap. I've been off the ball on making sure I upload these. And I feel like there's a certain kind of pride I must take in this, because ultimately I make it just for myself. I upload these things. In reality, I could just move on my life. No one's going to probably be in my comments being like, where is the rest of the D&D series? Did it fall off? Did you stop making it? No one's going to be doing that. But I take a certain pride in doing this, so here I am, 6 months later. I'm getting back on the ball, and I'm uploading all the episodes that I forgot about, and making the recaps for the episodes that I either lost or forgot to save, or however you want to put it. And so this is going to cover two pretty important episodes of sorts. In reality, it's probably about 3 or 4. But this is going to cover the 7-year time skip between last episode, where the party gets basically TPK'd and Hawkins runs off with Bulk, and then ends up, basically the session ends with Bulk and Hawkins about to assassinate Boltitude, and it fades to black. And then we have a 7-year time skip, which me and the players actually, to some extent, played out, and then we get back into real sessions 7 years later, which ended up being about, I think, a month, maybe 2 weeks, a month of us taking a break in person. So I'm going to go over some of the things that happened in the 7-year time skip, which is a lot. I'm going to make it very brief and probably only get the really important parts. And this is all from my memory too. Like my notes, my notes are not good on this. Okay, like I can probably pop them up real quick and just show you. Like, let me just pop this up. These are my notes for session 75, 76, which are the recap. You can see there's like nothing here. Like it's all written down. It's not in my. I just need to make notes of it. It's all in a physical notebook that I made, which I'm not going to show you right now, even though I have it beside me somewhere. And basically in that physical notebook, what I did was I made so there's 7 years, I wrote the name of every month and what year that month was in, and then I wrote something that happened. And then we basically went through the entire list of 7 years. So there was a lot to go over. It took a long time. Some of it was more fun than other parts, but the players got a lot of rewards from it. A little bit too much. Some of them are really strong now. But I digress. I digress. Oh, my camera just went off. I mean, it's still working, but it just went off. Let me see if I can turn that back on. No, I can't. I guess I'll pretend I can see myself in my camera and not look at the screen. So, I'm just going to get into what happened in these 7 years. Firstly, I want to change songs because this is really throwing me off. You know, I thought the Cowboy Bebop thing would be really good, but instead, it's really throwing me off. Give me one moment so I can try and... Alright, we're going into the 7 years. So it starts off, Hawkins ends up being on his own. Him and Bulk decide this plan. Bulk is going to focus on Twilight Redemption and try and get strength there. And Hawkins is going to focus on the government. So his plan is to basically join the government and worked for Afonso as they were offered earlier, and basically tried to recover with a plan of coming back in 7 years to save the party. So Hawkins joins Afonso and Dontalia and starts working for them. His first order of business is taking care of a problem I believe was mentioned some point in the past, which is the dead bodies of the original party, including Krokul, that was killed by Sothis, has been re-risen by the cursed armor that Stavros was wearing back in the day, and they're currently basically causing a lot of issues. Hawkins goes off and he solves this issue. He gets some troops together, and he goes and basically quells this rebellion, killing all of the old party members who have been reanimated, including himself. During this, I believe he ends up taking some serious wounds. He now has a permanent hand mark over his face. It's a burn into his face where he didn't want to kill Kira because he kind of saw her after her just died in front of him. He hesitated, and he hesitated long enough for Kira to basically get a permanent wound on him, the fake Kira. And so he now has a permanent scar, a handprint on his face before he killed her. And then at the very end, he took a pretty serious wound from, I believe, Stavros' corpse. And now he has a permanent limp, or he did at this point. But through that, he meets Neelam, played by Un, which I'm not going to really describe too much of what the characters are. You'll see them in the next few sessions if you're paying attention. No point in wasting time. So Un joins them. Then they go off to focus on the Avum Order, because that was the plan. I believe the plan was already talked about in the previous sessions, what Afonso wanted to do, so I don't think I need to harp on that too much. But they decide to go off to the Avum Order. They're going to become generals and try and fulfill this idea that Afonso had of how to basically make things work very well. Let me see if I can fix this. Okay. So they go to the Avum Order, and to keep it very simple, they start going to wars, they start having a hard time, and they go through a long process of taking key cities, losing battles, going through that process there, until eventually they get to the final city, which has Ulthis Dendril. And at this point, I think the other party members have gotten involved somehow. I don't remember exactly how. I think they met at Castle Oddity, which is a castle Hawkins built. We can show you on the map, actually, where that is. If I can ever pop it up. Go to Foundry. Let me go to the map. So Hawkins now has Castle Oddity. He was given this territory, which is beside the huge crater, if you remember, that was caused by the Night Lords fighting a long time ago. So he now owns this little bit of territory, and he built a castle named Castle Oddity, and he was promoted, I think, to like a count or something by Galvera. So he's now nobility. He has his own castle, and here he ends up recruiting the other party members, which is Morden, played by Mo5, and Professor Dirt, played by Peabody. And the five of them end up running off, and they go to the Avum Order, which is over here when you pop up on the Orpus map. They go to the Avum Order over here, and slowly but surely they start taking the key settlements from here. I think there's 3 main castles. Set the castle here, eventually set the castle here, and until eventually they got to the final castle, which is basically protecting the giant bridge that connects this continent to the fallen continent. And they end up taking this city. Michael Gar, played by Leroy, ends up deciding to duel the leader of the Avum Order, Ulthis Dendril, also known as the Heart Piercer. He ends up beating him pretty easily, actually. It was quite amazing. He ends up beating him. He ends up taking his weapon, Anacertia, the Deforming Lance, and which is now his main weapon, and which gained him a lot of potential and a lot of fame from that. And at the very end of them defeating, I believe it was Haluzan was the name of the castle, a giant army from the fallen continent ends up marching over, an army full of demons and monsters and things. They march over and they attack the cap city and basically force Kadoi to fully retreat. Like, Kadoi fully retreats. Like, straight up. They fully retreat. They lose everything. The fallen continent invades. The monster army invades and starts taking things over. And then as they're retreating, at some point in time, I don't even know when, at some point in time, Kronos the Shamed blows up Mount Matrod here. Like, Mount Matrod ends up blowing up. Let me go back to this map. Mount Matrod ends up blowing up, erupting, and then the lava. He did it during a time when I believe a huge army was coming through for reinforcements, and he basically wiped out a large majority of the army of the Senate and all people of power here in Joster Gate as they're passing through. So Kronos does that and basically makes a fatal blow against Tudoi. The party hardens them retreat, and this entire part of the map is now cut off. And so the Lonely Knights down here are forced to fight the Fallen Continent on their own. Something we'll talk about later. So that's one war front. The war front over here on the west is still happening. Some other things that happen: Ambrose and Patura, the two Night Lords who killed the others and are now rebelling over here. Patura ends up being negotiated out of the alliance by Hawkins and Krupp. The Senate ends up offering her ex-lover, and Patura ends up basically leaving the alliance with Ambrose, greatly weakening this front and allowing them to push back. However, soon afterwards, Ambrose, Mystiline, ends up actually making a deal with the Eternal Tetralden to the north. He ends up being baptized in their religion, and they become allies and go to war with Tudoi, helping Ambrose. So now currently there's a huge war front going on where the Eternal Tetralden is coming to the south. The Avon Order is going... the Avon Order is dead at this point, but the Fallen Fallen Continent, is attacking. The monster armies are attacking this way. And then what happens is the Narnian monarchy sends an envoy to the Senate for something. However, Afonso orders Hawkins and his people to assassinate the envoy coming north, at which they do. They assassinate the envoy coming north, and that eventually leads to, not super directly, like the party doesn't realize that they're the cause of this, but that basically leads the Narnian monarchy to declare war on Tudoi. So now there's a three-front war where the Eternal Tetralden and Ambrose are attacking the west, own the west side. The Fallen Continent, which is not blocked off, is basically attacking this side, and the Narnian monarchy is attacking from the south. So Tudoi ends up getting this really awful situation, a really, really awful situation. Then, during all this, they are ordered, Afonso gives them another order. Afonso orders Hawkins and them. The only person who does not do this is Neelam, who is very religious, and he probably would have went through with it. It's actually hidden from Neelam. Afonso orders Hawkins and crew to come to Silfrin, the capital of Tudoi, and to dress up, basically secretly burn down the Golden Cathedral of Prosperity, the Church of the Rings, to burn it down. And he basically tells Hawkins, you'll know when the time is right. And what that means is, at some point during this, after the alliance with the Eternal Tetralden, Ambrose Mystiline, our favorite psychotic Night Lord who's killed everyone and went insane, ends up making a tunnel from Emeth Castle through the Endless Mountain Peaks into the back of Silfrin, and he launches a surprise attack on Silfrin and starts razing the capital city to the ground. Not only that, Ambrose goes into the Senate and assassinates, I think, 98% of the senators. I think only 3 senators survive. There's like 500 senators, and he ends up going there and he assassinates all of them. They're having a meeting, and he shows up in the meeting and he just kills them all. So this causes the Senate to crumble. Eventually, after the group burns down the church, Ambrose and his group are basically, his forces pushed out, and they retake Silfrin. However, the Senate is dead. And this is where things get very interesting in the 7 years. This is the later part of the 7 years, I think the last 2 years. What happens is Afonso, now that the Senate is dead, Afonso, with his reputation, for whatever reason he was not in the Senate, Afonso, with his reputation, decides to have a meeting with everyone, all the important figures, and he decides to appoint himself Emperor of Tudoi. He doesn't forcefully do it, but he kind of puts it to a vote, and everyone votes him to be Emperor of Tudoi. and they changed Trodoy, the Republic of Trodoy here. We see the words, the Republic of Trodoy changes into an empire. It is now known as the Trodoyan Empire, or the Empire of Trodoy. And the emperor is Afonso Inditzer, which just left a sour taste in some of the party members, but he did it. During this time as well, now this is, I think, one of the last really important things. I might be missing something, but who cares? It's not that crazy. During this time as well, because the Church of Golden Prosperity in the Rings was burned down during the ambush on Silfrin by Ambrose and the Eternal Tetraden, the Church of the Rings uses that as an excuse to make a crusade, to launch a crusade against the Eternal Tetraden, which is a religious state and does not follow the Rings. So it's a religious state that does not follow the Rings. So since their church was burned down, presumably by them in the raid, they take that as an act of religious aggression, and the Church of the Rings decides to launch a crusade against the Eternal Tetraden as retribution. However, the other major religion of the world, the Orbitus Triumphant, which the Eternal Tetraden kind of falls under, they decide that it's not a justified crusade. And so they basically tell the Church of the Rings, you're not allowed to crusade against the Eternal Tetraden, else we'll have to make force against you. So what ends up happening is the Church of the Rings says, screw you, we're going to crusade the Eternal Tetraden anyway, since they burned down our church in Silfrin. So then the Orbitus Triumphant says, okay, since you're going to crusade the Eternal Tetraden unjustifiably, we are going to launch a defensive crusade against you. So what ends up happening is this insane situation where there is a three-front war from the south invading north, the east invading west. Basically the northwest invading south, and this over here is kind of safe. But the west invading south, and then the churches made a deal with Afonso, where they're allowed to fight each other in this crusade, basically in the territory of Trodoy, because it's basically here on the verge. Like here's the Tetraden, and so that basically means the churches are going to be fighting each other, crusading the Eternal Tetraden, and the defensive crusade is going to be fighting them off. So basically, these two world-scale crusades are going to be happening in this region of the world, and so they make a deal with Afonso. Which, let me put this back on my face. They make a deal with Afonso, where every person who is killed, like every innocent who is involved, and every building that is destroyed, like all the territory hurt in this fight, it is going to basically they pay a certain amount of money for every innocent person hurt and building or like property hurt. So basically they have to pay a lot of money, but they are allowed to fight in this region at crusade. So what ends up happening, there's 3 different wars happening, 2 world scale crusades happening in this area. And so the Empire of Trodoy turns into a massive war zone, a huge war zone, which is still happening in the current moment, mind you. And let's go back to this here so I can show you like what is really happening here. So this entire region over here, is virtually owned by Ambrose at this point. A little bit has been pushed back by Afonso, but for the most part, this entire region is owned by Ambrose and the Eternal Tetraden, and the Crusades are happening over here for the most part. This entire southern region at this point it is controlled by the Narnian monarchy. They end up being pushed up this way. And the entire west side, this is cut off from the nation. This here is basically fending off against an entire continent. And no one knows how they're doing. They're basically on their own. And everything else. So basically all Trodoy is now is this here, this region, and this region. That's the only safe-ish areas. So that's what ends up happening to the world. And during this entire time, Hawkins in Castle Audi, he becomes a general. They all become generals, and they get very important, and they're involved in these fights. And they end up, at one point, almost dying, because during these fights, they get betrayed by, if you remember, there are some major factions here. The Reformists, which are led by Afonso Inditzer, who is trying to reform the nation, which he obviously has done. and the traditionalists, who are the majority of the Senate, and they were trying to keep things the same, keep people oppressed. Obviously, it's obvious that the traditionalists are basically wiped out now with the death of the Senate. However, before the Senate was fully dead, or when the power was still there, the main general of the Senate went to Castle Oddity to summon Hawkins and his troops for a large push out. Basically, they were amassing an army at Castle Oddity. And during this time, they were basically betrayed where they're surrounded, and while they're being summoned to help join the fight, and their troops, all the other troops turned on them and tried to kill them, and they're nearly wiped out before the Fraudolians came to save them, and Aldania Petalfoot came to save them. And so these are two other things I want to talk about briefly that are important for characters, for you to understand as characters. Back before Mount Matrod blew up, Hawkins was warned by, I think, Kronos or Bulk or something, that they were going to blow up Mount Matrod, and that they should get the Fraudolians out of there and relocate them if they don't want them to die. So there's this whole thing where they went to the ruins of Maplewood, and they went to the Maplewood Swamp, and they fought Sothis and his clones. Sothis is really powerful now. They ended up taking an army there and fighting Sothis, who they didn't kill, but they managed to hold off long enough to basically extract all of the Fraudolians with their king, Krokul Urtad. And so they relocated the Fraudolians to up here somewhere. And then, Mount Matrod blew up, and whatever happened there happened. And then during this 7 years, Hawkins also took the time to basically eradicate the river rats, who used to be in Maplewood, and they had some beef with. They eradicated them from Port Crevice. They ended up attacking their bases. They did not manage to catch or kill the leaders of the river rats. They ran off, so they're still out in the world somewhere. However, in the process of raiding the river rats, they actually found Aldania Petalfeet and set her free. Or did they? No, they didn't. Did they? No, they didn't find her. However, the river rats were in possession of Aldania, and so through all this, Aldania managed to escape, and she ran off, and she did her own thing. So during this time when they're getting basically surrounded and about to be killed in this betrayal of this massive army betrayal, where they're surrounded, they're basically in this they're in the crater that was left by the Night Lords, and they're surrounded. As the last push is happening to kill them, on the horizon, basically on the cusp of this giant crater, the flags of a giant army of Fraudolians led by Krokul, they basically rise up on the west side, and basically in the last moments of the last 200 troops and Hawkins and the other party members, they yell out, "Look to the west, Lord!" And you see the flags of the Fraudolians who have come to the aid of Castle Oddity in its last moments. And then on the east side, some other flags rise up, and they yell out again, "To the east, more flags rise!" Kind of like that scene in Lord of the Rings, whenever the Rohan, or maybe it's in The Hobbit, maybe it's in both of them probably, when the Rohan, what do we call it? The Rohan horsemen and the elves, they rise, they basically come over the edge of the hill, and you see their flags and their massive army just kind of lined up. You see that on the other side as you see the flag of what ends up being the Vegetans and Aldania. And Vegeta as well, mind you. And so these two armies, basically, they're reintroduced to Aldania, and as the Fraudolians and Aldania and the Vegetans, they come to save their allies. And they're reintroduced to Aldania, and they learn about her fate. And Tiny Plant is reintroduced to her mother, of course, blah, blah, blah. It's really sweet. So they get saved there. And then they end up relocating Aldania and her grove up here, kind of close to the Fraudolians. So now they have this triangle of power, where here they have Castle Oddity, they have the camp of the Fraudolians, and then they have Aldania's grove somewhere up in here. And I think that's about it for the 7-year time skip. They do all these things. He becomes emperor. The wars get worse. And that's kind of where the game is at now, where there's all these wars. There's death everywhere. It's all plagued by things. So then we're going to get into the end of the 7 years, which starts off with What do we? Let me go back to my camera so we can go back to this. So we're going to get back into what is now, I believe, session like 76, 77, whenever we actually start playing again. So this is when we start playing again. So we start off at the end of the 7 years whenever the party has a little bit of free time. Hawkins vowed 7 years ago that he's going to come back and save Revan, Idramor, and Power, who are currently captured and being held by the dragons and are being tortured over and over. So the first thing we do is we have a session where they go and they fight these dragons. We had done so much of the dragon lair that we were all, I think I was, and I'm sure they were too. We were just sick of the dragons. We were sick of fighting kobolds and the dragons and all that stuff. So we didn't do any fights. We did a couple rolls to see how good they did, see if any of the dragons escape. I think we just stole the same thing we did for the last 7 years. What ended up happening is, no, they didn't escape. They ended up killing both Leonadrin and Lornadon. And I believe Hawkins actually used one of the nails, which they had for the Defenders of Dordogne originally. And I believe he captured the soul of Leonadrin, so now he has her to summon back at some point, I think. So they end up killing them. They take their bodies. They get on the ships. They brought like a navy for all this. Like they brought an army. Like they wiped them out. Like straight up, they wiped them out. Oh, during this time, really important to state here, Felonial, who was working for the dragons there, was very quickly recruited by Hawkins and now basically runs Castle Oddity and is their secretary. Felonial, the Perfidious, who was originally enslaved to these dragons and helped them in that fight, was kind of helping Hawkins in them, and was the one who killed Kira, is now in service of Hawkins and is part of that group. Anyway, moving on. So they end up killing the dragons, they take their bodies, and they start heading back to Port Crevice. And during this time, Hawkins is reuniting with the party members. Revan, the old party members have been tortured for the last 7 years. Power is completely nonsensical. Power is mind broken. Basically, what's happened to Power is through the 7 years of being tortured, the personalities that they have taken over through touching this book have started melding together. So they're not really themselves anymore. They're like really messed up. And even right now in the game, they're like in confinement, like trying to be rehabilitated, and it's not going very well. And one of the big risks here is like a lot of the personality of Noreen, who they were for a long time, has seeped out. So it's almost like Noreen has been reborn in some forms. So Power is a huge mess. Revan is pretty much fine. I mean, he was tortured and things, but he's been alive for 1,000 years. Oh, well, less than that, but he's undead and things like that. He is basically fine, and he actually pretty quickly separates with Hawkins, saying that the first thing he'll let him know, or telling Hawkins that he'll be the first one to know whenever he finds Jackal-Eyes, and Revan decides to go off with his 2 dogs and find Jackal-Eyes. So he separates from them right away. Idramor is a little bit different. Idramor, somehow, I'm actually kind of glad that this wasn't recorded, because I don't think it's important. I think there's a little bit of silliness whenever we were playing in the moment. But Idramor somehow convinced Hawkins to like be more evil than he was. Idramor's like, now that I'm back, let's show them what we're all about. Revenge or death or making them suffer, making the world suffer for what they've done. Basically making people suffer who deserve to suffer. And Hawkins was weirdly enough on board with it. But I think that's changed at this point in time. So they had a reunion. Idramor decided to stick around with the party for the moment. And so what ends up happening is they get back to Port Crevice. They end up actually selling the bodies to a guy named to a guy named Bison, who was looking to buy dragon body parts. So he ends up selling the body parts, the 2 dead bodies, to Bison, Garuda, who buys them, who they don't really know too much about, which they'll learn more about in the soon future. But they sell the body parts, and they head back off to Castle Oddity, where they start recuperating and rest. And I believe, I'm trying to think of what Let me look at my notes here, because it's very important. In my notes, I'll be able to tell. I'm trying to think what happens next. Where do we end off on? Dun 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 dun. Oh, another important thing. During this boat ride of them reuniting, Hawkins ends up confiding. Actually, not yet. This is what happens. They get the castle oddity, and they end up having a big feast. They invite everyone they're close to. They invite Tiny Plant, Aldania, Crocal, Vegeta, Idrimore. They invite everyone there to have like one last feast. And there Hawkins ends up breaking the news to everyone that he's actually a necromancer. He ends up like spilling the beans on all this stuff. He admits that he's a necromancer, blah, 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 all these things. Jesus, I forgot this happened too. This is actually really important. I can't believe I forgot this part. So he ends up basically at this feast, Hawkins decides he's going to reveal everything to everyone and be very honest from this point forward. So he reveals that he's a necromancer. Cool. He reveals that Jeddah and Valen, they're all undead. He also reveals a very important amount of information that he got from Bulk. Bulk, during the 7 years, decided to properly trust him and give him more information than he'd given him in the past. So during the 7 years, Hawkins found a lot out about Kronos the Shamed. And what this information was that he ends up sharing with the party, he reveals that Kronos the Shamed is actually virtuous Emperor Rihdar, who was assassinated 50 years ago. The emperor of the entire world about 50 years ago, who's assassinated after he genocided all the lizard folk, which Hawkins hates. He loves the lizard folk, but hates they did that. So he basically reveals that Kronos the Shamed is actually the most important man in the world who went crazy and was assassinated. He's somehow still alive, and he's hiding out, and he's doing these things, and he's pretending to be this person named Kronos. Now, the party takes this how they will. It's very hard to digest, very shocking information, realizing that the most important person in the world is, in fact, what can I say? The most important person in the world is, in fact, Kronos, and still alive, and evil, and has done a lot of awful things to you. Anyway, so that's revealed, and they're having this dinner, and the session ends with a knock on the door. Like that, a knock on the door. And they go and open the door, and there in front of them, they see the Night Lord Ambrose Mystiline and his advisor Charmy Brighton, which sends them all in the shock. As probably the most evil and wanted, like criminal number one, most wanted number one in Godoy, is somehow in their castle and right in front of them, trying to basically entering their dinner. As he enters, he smiles and he sits down and he says, "Well, let's have a chat, shall we?" And with that, the session ends, and I believe from this point forward, the sessions are in order again. So, fingers crossed. I think that covers it all. That covers it well enough, so any important information. This video is already too long, so this is it. Adios. You'll see the deal that Ambrose Jan ends up making with them that session.